Michael Jackson, man, even now, years after he's gone, his name always just kind of pulls us into these like really intense conversations. It's pretty wild how much his story keeps like getting examined over and over. And that's actually exactly what we're going to be doing today.
Totally. Yeah. Some figures just become these lightning rods, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think with Michael Jackson, the layers of his life and his whole legacy are so complex that it's almost like we can't help but keep coming back to it.
And to get into some of that complexity, we've got some pretty interesting insights for you guys today. We're going deep on the views of somebody who was super close to the situation, Michael Jackson's former bodyguard, Matt Fiddes.
Right. We've been checking out excerpts from his interviews on the Dan Wooten Outspoken YouTube channel. It's a really, really in-depth conversation, that tackles some of the big issues that people are still talking about and wondering about, around Michael Jackson.
And what gets me is how long Fiddes was actually with Michael, like over a decade. That kind of close-up, long-term access has got to give you some really unique firsthand insight into who Michael was, especially when it comes to some of the more controversial stuff. So what we're going to do today is unpack what Fiddes thinks about a few key things. His relationships with kids and animals, the whole child abuse thing, his fights with Sony Music, that weird Epstein connection, and his take on Leaving Neverland and the upcoming biopic. So first off, let's dive into what Fiddes had to say about Michael's relationships with kids and animals. Like, what did he say was at the core of those connections?
Well, according to Fiddes, the big thing was this deep sense of trust that Michael felt. He keeps saying over and over that Michael had a genuine and really deep connection with both kids and animals,
And why were those relationships so important to Michael? Why those in particular?
Because he really believed, strongly, that kids and animals were the only ones in his life who weren't trying to use him. They didn't care about his fame, his money, or getting something from him.
It's like he felt isolated, even though he was this huge global star. Kind of sad, actually.
Totally. Fiddes talks about how Michael felt that the adults around him, even the ones who seemed close, always had an angle. So yeah, it makes sense that he'd look for connections where things were simpler and more genuine.
You just hit on something really important. When people talk about these relationships, there's this specific focus.
Yeah, the narrative always seems to zoom in on young boys.
Right. So what's Fiddes' take on that? What's he adding to that part of the story?
This is crucial what Fiddes is saying. He's very clear that Michael's inner circle wasn't only young boys. There were definitely girls in the mix, too. He specifically mentions Michael's nieces and nephews, the kids of Tito and Jackie Jackson, as being around all the time.
So a different picture than what we usually hear.
Exactly. And Fiddes sees this focus on just boys as deliberate. He thinks it was done on purpose to make Michael look as bad as possible.
Which, of course, takes us to those child abuse allegations. Fiddes was with Michael when all that was going down. How does he see those claims? Does he think they're true?
Well, because Fiddes paints this picture of Michael as always feeling vulnerable and pressured, he sees these accusations as the worst possible attack.
The ultimate attack. Why does he say that?
He thinks it's the most damaging thing you could throw at someone as famous and rich as Michael, especially because he had so much control over music rights and all that.
Yeah, that adds a whole other layer to it.
And Fiddes points out that the FBI spent 10 years investigating Michael.
10 years? That's a crazy amount of time and resources.
Right. They were tapping his phones and everything. And in the end, they didn't find anything to back up those abuse claims.
And we can't forget that not guilty verdict from the trial. That's something Fiddes emphasizes, right?
Oh, absolutely. He sees the FBI not finding anything, and that verdict as proof that these allegations were BS. He really doesn't seem to believe they came from a genuine place,
What does he mean? What's he suggesting?
Well, particularly with the first accusation, the one from Evan Chandler. Fiddes says Chandler went to Michael first with a movie script he wanted to sell him.
So it started as a business deal, basically.
Exactly. And according to Fiddes, those child abuse claims only came after the movie deal fell through.
That's a pretty big difference from the story most people know.
It is. And Fiddes also mentions these alleged audio recordings that supposedly leaked online where Chandler's talking about how to, quote, win big time.
Whoa, hold up. So Fiddes is saying there might have been some shady stuff going on behind the scenes with those initial claims.
That's definitely what he seems to be getting at. He's hinting that it might not have been as straightforward as it seemed,
Yeah, that's for sure. Okay, let's move on to something else Fiddes talks about in those interviews. Michael's beef with Sony Music. This is something other people like Candace Owens have talked about too. They've talked about how the music industry wants to control artists. What does Fiddes add to that conversation?
Well, what's really interesting is how Fiddes actually backs up what Owens is saying about the music industry wanting to control artists like Michael.
So he agrees with her.
Yeah. He tells this story about how Michael wanted to have this big public protest right outside Sony Music. And get this, he wanted to do it on a double-decker bus.
No way, a double-decker bus. That's pretty out there.
Yeah. And the idea was to have people on the bus chanting, "Terminate Mata." That was about Tommy Mottola, the guy who ran Sony back then.
That's a bold move.
It is. Fiddes also says that Mariah Carey, who was married to Mottola at the time, told Michael that Sony wasn't really promoting his Invincible album the way they should.
Wow. So according to Fiddes, this wasn't just Michael thinking thing. He supposedly got confirmation from inside Sony.
That's what he says. But the big problem, the thing that really caused all this drama, was Michael's Beatles catalog.
That's right. Fiddes explains that Michael had to put up a lot of collateral for his album.
That's pretty normal for big artists.
True, but this was on a whole other level. Because Neverland Ranch was in debt, Michael had to use his share of the Beatles catalog, plus Eminem's catalog, and even the rights to the song Happy Birthday as security for his projects.
Those are like some seriously valuable assets.
We're talking over $1 billion worth of stuff. And Michael, according to Fiddes, thought Sony was sabotaging Invincible on purpose.
Wait, intentionally? That's a big accusation.
It is. And Fiddes says the reason they might have done that is because they hoped Michael would default on his loan. That way, Sony could get their hands on that Beatles catalog.
That's crazy if it's true. Did Fiddes say if Michael told anyone else about this?
He did. He says Michael even told his fans about it at one of his fan events.
So it wasn't like a secret. He was going public with these accusations. It just shows how much he didn't trust these big companies.
For sure. And I think it backs up Fiddes' whole point that there were these powerful people working against Michael, which probably played a part in all the controversy surrounding him. Now, let's talk about something that's been in the news a lot lately. Michael's name being on those alleged Epstein lists. Obviously, that freaked a lot of people out. How does Fiddes explain that?
Fiddes is pretty straightforward about how Michael's name might have ended up there. He says Michael was good friends with Barry Gibb from the Bee Gees, who lived in Palm Beach.
Right. That whole area was known for attracting rich and famous people.
Yeah. And when Michael was working on an album with Gibb, he was staying at his place, and he got interested in buying property in Palm Beach, too.
So he was checking out houses, huh?
Yep. According to Fiddes, Michael hired a real estate agent to show him some fancy properties. Fiddes says he was there with Michael for this.
And that's where Epstein comes in.
Exactly. Fiddes says they looked at a bunch of houses, and one of them just happened to be owned by Jeffrey Epstein.
So Fiddes is saying it was pure coincidence.
Yeah. He says Michael had never met Epstein before, and that they just happened to see his house while they were looking around.
And he's really specific about when this happened, too, right?
Right. He points out that this was back in 2003 when Epstein wasn't this infamous guy yet.
Yeah, he hadn't been caught for all the terrible things he did.
Right. So it was just a quick thing. Maybe they drove by the house and that was it. Fiddes gets kind of annoyed that people don't talk about this more, you know? It shows how easy it is for these random connections to get twisted and blown out of proportion, especially online.
That's so true, especially now. We have to be really careful about jumping to... Okay, let's move on to something else that's been a big deal. The whole thing about Michael sleeping in the same bed as kids. That came up a lot in those Piers Morgan interviews. What did Fiddes think about that?
Fiddes doesn't deny that those sleeping arrangements were weird.
So he admits it was a little strange.
He does. He says straight up that as a dad, he would never be okay with some grown man or even a kid he didn't know sleeping in his kid's bed.
That's pretty blunt.
Yeah. He even calls the parents in the Jordy Chandler case reprehensible.
Wow, that's hard.
And he even goes further and says Child Protective Services should have gotten involved. So he definitely gets how messed up that whole situation looks to people on the outside.
He's not trying to sugarcoat it, but he does talk about Neverland itself in a different way, doesn't he?
Yes. He's like, that was just one situation. Neverland was different. He says Michael's bedroom there was huge, like a small house. It had tons of beds, bathrooms, even an arcade and a fire.
Really? That doesn't even sound like a bedroom.
Exactly. And Fiddes says kids were always hanging out in that space, watching TV, eating snacks, sometimes falling asleep.
Including his own kids and other family members' kids.
Exactly. He mentions his sons, Tito Jackson's sons, and others. He's saying that Neverland wasn't just Michael's private home. You know, it was this super secure place with staff and security everywhere. So his bedroom suite was like the only truly private spot he had in that.
That helps paint a picture of the layout, at least. What about all that security at Neverland? Some people think it was meant to hide inappropriate stuff.
Fiddes says no way. He's adamant that all that security alarms going off if someone came near Michael's room was just to keep Michael safe. He was a huge star, and people were always trying to get to him.
So just a safety measure for Michael himself.
That's what he says. He's like, lots of big Hollywood people have the same kind of security. And he's really clear that it had nothing to do with hiding any of.
Okay, let's talk about that upcoming Michael Jackson biopic that everyone's excited about. With everything we've talked about, the filmmakers are going to have to address this stuff. Really? What's Fiddes hoping to see in the film?
He thinks they can't avoid the child abuse stuff. Too big a part of Michael's story.
Yeah, it would be weird to just ignore it.
Right. But Fiddes really hopes the film will show that those allegations were BS.
So he's optimistic that the film could change some minds or clear Michael's name.
Yeah. He points out that the movie's being made with the Michael Jackson estate and the same people who did Bohemian Rhapsody about Queen. So he thinks it's going to be a big, important film that shows the real Michael.
And he also has some thoughts on when that Leaving Neverland documentary came out, doesn't he?
Yeah, he thinks it was planned that way. Fiddes believes that Dan Reed, the guy who directed Leaving Neverland, put it out at the same time as the biopic on purpose.
Smart, if you think about it. Why would he do that?
It's called newsjacking. It's when you time your stuff to come out when everyone's already talking about something similar. In this case, the Michael Jackson biopic. That way, people who are interested in Michael's story might stumble on your documentary too, even if it's telling a completely different story.
Like hopping on the bandwagon.
Exactly. And Fiddes thinks that the biopic getting delayed might have messed that plan up.
Interesting. So Fiddes seems to be standing up for Michael based on what he saw firsthand.
Yeah, he clearly believes that Michael was innocent.
And you mentioned that Dan Wooten himself talked about how he used to think about these cases, the whole believe all victims thing.
That's actually a big part of their conversation. Wooten admits he was wrong about how he saw the Michael Jackson case before.
What changed his mind?
He says he didn't really respect the not guilty verdict. He also talks about how being in the media spotlight himself has made him understand how intense media scrutiny can be and how important it is to remember that people are innocent until proved.
So his own experiences made him rethink his views on the case.
Exactly. And he even apologized for saying some pretty bad things about Lorraine Kelly for how she covered the Michael Jackson case.
Wow, that's a big deal. It just shows that people can change how they see things, especially after going through something themselves. So let's just recap what Fiddes said. He says that Michael's relationships with kids were just friendly, not sexual. Michael needed trust and connection, not to relive his childhood,
And he's very clear that Michael had girls in his close circle, too, not just boys. He says the abuse allegations were a way to attack Michael because he was so famous, rich, and powerful in the music world. He reminds us that the FBI couldn't find any proof, and the court found Michael not guilty.
Yeah.
He also says that Michael didn't trust adults because he thought they were always after something. That's why he liked kids and animals better. He backs up the idea that Sony might have tried to screw Michael over to get his Beatles catalog.
And he says that Epstein thing was a total coincidence.
Right, and even though the sleeping arrangements were strange, he blames the parents and says Neverland was a unique situation. He thinks the biopic will have to deal with the accusations, but he hopes it'll clear Michael's name.
And Wooten's whole thing about changing his mind shows us how complicated these cases are. It's important to look at everything and respect what the courts decide, even if it's not what people think or what the media is saying. So, with all the attention Michael got and all the different stories about him, what do you guys think? How can we figure out the truth about someone like that, especially now that he's gone? How do we balance personal stories like Matt Fiddes's with the official stuff and all the media hype?
That's a tough question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. We got to look at everything, think about why people are saying what they're saying, and really think about the evidence.
That's the truth, and it's something we should all keep thinking about. Anyway, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Michael Jackson's story. It's a complicated one.
Thanks for having us.
We'll see you next time.